And Enoch also, the seventh from Adam, prophesied of these, saying, Behold, the Lord cometh with 10,000 of his saints to execute judgment upon all. Jude chapter 1. The question is, how do the days of Enoch relate to Christ coming with all of his saints on Judgment Day? Well, remember in part 1 of our study, we learned that the 7 generations from Adam to Enoch revealed that we will be changed or translated like Enoch when the last Adam, Jesus Christ, comes at the end of the world, according to 1 Corinthians chapter 15. Therefore, the 7 generations of Adam represent a time when we call upon the name of the Lord, as in the days of Enoch, the 3rd generation of Adam, in hopes that God will send a preacher like Enoch that we might be saved. And so in part 2 of our study, we're going to learn that Enoch's 365 years, that is the 7th generation of Adam, is a time of salvation when we spiritually observe the Feast of Tabernacles as we take the gospel into the world shortly before the end when Christ comes with all of his saints to judge those who have gone the way of Cain. We begin with Genesis chapter 5, where we read about the 7th generation of Adam, that is Enoch's 365 years. Verse 22. And Enoch walked with God after he begat Methuselah 300 years, and begat sons and daughters. And all the days of Enoch were 365 years, and Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. Now, as we learned in part 1 of our study, God took Enoch in the sense that he was translated so that he would not see death. In other words, he would not suffer the penalty of the first Adam, through which all men not only experience spiritual death, but physical death, according to 1 Corinthians chapter 15. It is in this context that God also informs us that the true believers of this last generation are like Enoch in that they will not experience physical death because they will also be changed when the last Adam comes at the end of the world. But does God provide additional details about Enoch's prophecy regarding Christ coming with all of his saints at the end of the world? Well, when we go to Zechariah chapter 14, we read that Christ will come with his saints to judge all nations in the valley of the mountains if they refuse to keep the Feast of Tabernacles when we worship God in spirit and truth. So in verse 5 we read, And ye shall flee the valley of the mountains, for the valley of the mountains shall reach unto Azel. Yea, ye shall flee like as ye fled from before the earthquake in the days of Uzziah, king of Judah. And the Lord my God shall come, and all of his saints with thee. So God is not telling us to flee to the valley of the mountains. He's telling us to flee the valley of mountains because the valley is where there's going to be a great slaughter of those nations that came against Jerusalem. And so in this context, God informs us that the valley reaches to Azel. That is the inheritance of the tribe of Benjamin, a figure of God's elect or chosen, who will retake possession of the kingdom, that is the gate of Benjamin, as well as the territory from Geba to Rimmon, which is south of Jerusalem, which is a figure of God's kingdom. And this idea reminds us of the saints in Daniel chapter 7, who retook possession of the kingdom to resume their mandate to evangelize the world after Satan the beast was destroyed, while his ministers, the rest of the beasts, lost dominion for a time and season. That is the latter rain and the Feast of Tabernacles that we're going to learn about in Zechariah chapter 14. So let's begin with verse 16 of Zechariah 14, where we read about the Feast of Tabernacles. And it shall come to pass that every one that is left of all nations which came against Jerusalem shall even go up from year to year to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, and to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. And it shall be that whosoever will not come up of the families of the earth unto Jerusalem to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, upon them shall be no rain. And if the family of Egypt go not up and come not, that have no rain, there shall be the plague wherewith the Lord will smite the heathen that come not up to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. So we see that before Christ comes with all of his saints, he expects them to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. And according to Deuteronomy chapter 31, verse 10, we observe the Feast of Tabernacles at the end of every 7 years as we take the latter rain gospel into the world. And since leaving the church in the year 2000 AD, we have been observing 7-year intervals of the Feast of Tabernacles, the last of which will likely be from 2021 to October 11, 2028, which is the last day of the Feast of Tabernacles. And so God is warning us that if we fail to keep the Feast of Tabernacles, there will be no rain. In other words, there will be no sound doctrine which turns us from error to truth. And so, when we go back to Jude, we find that Enoch is prophesying against those who follow the way of Cain, warning that they will be like trees that wither because they receive no clouds from water, that is rain. We begin in verse 11. Woe unto them, for they have gone the way of Cain, and ran greedily after the error of Balaam for reward, and perished in the gainsaying of Korah. These are spots in your feast of charity, when they feast with you, feeding themselves without fear. Clouds they are without water, that is rain, carried about of the winds, trees whose fruit withereth. And the word wither reminds us of the fig tree, that is Israel's synagogues that will wither and be cut down after 80 years, that is possibly in the year 2028, because they did not receive rain, that is sound doctrine which turns us from error to truth. In this respect, many synagogues in Israel continue to teach that we can become saved by keeping the works of the law. Hence, the end of verse 12 warns, they are without fruit, twice dead, plucked up by the roots. And as we continue in verse 14, we see that Enoch prophesied against these people. And Enoch also, the seventh from Adam, prophesied of these, saying, Behold, the Lord cometh with 10,000s of his saints, to execute judgment upon all, and to convince all that are ungodly among them of all their ungodly deeds, which they have ungodly committed, and all of their hard speeches which ungodly sinners have spoken against him. And in verse 18, God characterizes them as mockers of the last time. How that they told you there should be mockers in the last time, who should walk after their own ungodly lusts. In other words, instead of walking with God as did Enoch, they walked after their own lusts, because, as verse 19 and 20 notes, they did not have the Holy Spirit. And without the Holy Spirit, we will not be guided into truth, which is another indicator that we will not receive the latter rain. In short, God sent Enoch to provide a very clear timeline of events that will transpire before and after Christ comes with all of his saints. And he commands all nations to keep the appointed Feast of Tabernacles, ending with the last day of the feast in October 11, 2028.